So this is another seminar in our series on countering online hate and its offline consequences. The series is hosted by the Media and Peacebuilding Project at GW School for Media and Public Affairs and Over Zero in partnership with the World Bank. Each seminar covers individual chapters in a forthcoming book on the same topic, countering digital hate and its offline consequences. And for today's seminar, Maude Morrison will present her chapter, Mediating Online Spaces, How Social Media Affects Peace Processes and What Can Be Done About It, exploring the role of mediation in addressing harmful conflict-related content online. Maude is the advisor on social media and conflict mediation at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, a private mediation organization based in Switzerland. There, she leads a global team working on issues of social media and mediation in over 14 countries. Her expertise includes social media agreements, social media analysis, platform engagement, and conflict mediation. Prior to that, she was deputy director of Build Up, a nonprofit focused on peace building in the digital age. She has conducted research on social media and conflict, strategic uses of technology for peace building, and most recently has been focusing on the links between social media and peace negotiations. So we will leave about 35 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have a good amount of time at the end for discussion and any questions that arise. So I will hand it over to Maude.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So the purpose of today is for me to share a little bit about what is in my chapter. I think this chapter is maybe a little bit different to some of the others in the book, in that it's focusing really on quite a niche issue, I think, which is the link between social media and peace negotiations. So I'm not really talking about hate speech in the narrow sense of the term, but more the impact that harmful discourse, including hate speech, has on what is already pretty delicate work of peace talks and peace processes. I guess given the current situation, I think this is particularly relevant. We only have to look at the news to think about how peace talks are being influenced by the kind of information landscape that are around them. So you mentioned I work for HD. I think everyone here knows HD, mediation organization, until a few years ago, very traditional, kind of focused on offline dialogue. And we really had almost no understanding, very little capacity in the field of social media or digital in general. And so my job has been, with the help of some people here, to essentially change that and to look more deeply into the impact of social media on the work of a mediation organization. And I think the easiest way to start is by sharing an example from Libya. So at the end of late 2020, the Libya Political Dialogue Forum, which was a UN-led peace process, was underway. So a round of talks was underway in Tunis. 75 delegates from Libya were meeting inside a hotel to try to lay out a kind of roadmap for political reforms, which eventually would pave the way for elections, which may or may not happen. At the same time that those delegates were meeting in that room, a kind of storm was brewing online. So we saw the chief UN negotiator, who's in this picture, Stephanie Williams, was subject to a major online campaign of harassment, questioning her credentials and her personality in general. We saw fake accounts purporting to be members of the delegation cropping up on Facebook, and we saw a coordinated network of fake accounts trying to spread narratives that were undermining those talks. Much of that activity came from much of those fake accounts were then associated with key figures in Russia, according to the Stanford Internet Observatory report, which is really good. So what I'm trying to draw from this example is kind of the key claim or the key assumption that I had going into this chapter, which is that social media is disrupting peace processes and peace talks. And to kind of dig into that claim and understand how and why and what can be done about it, I conducted research through a literature review, but also through interviews and conversations with key people working on peace processes, so mediators from within HD and beyond. My claim, having done this research, is that social media does appear to be disrupting peace processes in some ways, and in particular in 4 key ways. So there are 4 kind of harms that I've seen social media be used to disrupt peace processes, and from those I draw out 3 key recommendations in the chapter about what can be done. So for those of you that are not in the mediation world, peace processes are essentially the process of peace talks, a political process where conflicts are resolved by peaceful means. Now, they can mean many different things. There can be lots of different types of negotiations. For the purposes of this chapter, I focus really on what we call track 1 negotiations, which are negotiations between official representatives of conflict parties, facilitated by a third party, often an international actor, could be like an actor like HD or others. Now, we know, and we only need to look at the news to understand this in really stark terms, peace processes are really fragile moments in a country's trajectory. They represent an opportunity for a country to move away from violence. But we also know they're incredibly difficult, quite rarely successful, and they take a really long time. So you often have spoilers present, violations of agreements, even when they do occur, are common. And I think that social media is adding an additional complexity to that delicate equation. Social media is not making peace processes a completely different ball game, but they're adding a layer to an already really difficult topic. The reason I focus on peace processes specifically when it comes to social media is, 1, because I work on it, and that's what I'm doing day to day, and 2, because I think it's an area that we actually haven't really explored yet. We haven't really asked the question in much detail as to whether or not social media is really impacting peace talks. If you think about it, there's been a lot of research on the link between hate speech and violence when it comes to conflict, so places like Myanmar and Ethiopia, but much less about social media's impact on efforts to end those conflicts. So because this is a pretty underexplored area, this chapter is really, I hope, a kind of entry point, a starting point from which we can unpack this issue in more detail and really gather more evidence than I've been able to gather in this research process. So from the research that I have done and from what we have seen, we've identified 4 key harms, or 4 key ways in which we think social media can and is being used to disrupt efforts to negotiate peace. First, we see harassment of participants in talks and of mediators, which has knock-on effects on the participation of delegates and also on the mediation process itself. We see what we call malinformation being used to undermine peace processes, which I'll talk about in a second, was quite difficult to address. We see disinformation to undermine peace processes. We're seeing that a lot right now. And we also see coordinated inauthentic behavior, so more kind of inauthentic networks being used to interfere with the peace process. Now, none of these things are new. All of these things have been our key tactics by spoilers, by conflict parties throughout peace processes. But as with other presentations, what I'm interested in is the way that social media is making these tactics more effective, or making them spread more rapidly or with greater accuracy. So let me talk you through each of these 4 harms in a little bit more detail, and then I'll go on to talk about some of the impacts and some of the recommendations that I have. So first, harassment of mediators, participants in talks. This is probably the one that we have most examples for, or most evidence of. I talked about Stephanie Williams, the chief negotiator in the Libya Political Dialogue Forum, being subject to this hashtag campaign. We also saw in Libya several participants, and particularly the female participants in the dialogue, being subject to pretty severe online harassment, including death threats. And one female member of the Libya delegation described these as coordinated attempts to undermine her, led by very well organized efforts. This is something we've seen in other places too, and particularly when it comes to female participants in talks, which is and female mediators, which is quite concerning. The second harm that I look at is what I would call malinformation, so accurate information, but that is used or manipulated to undermine a peace process. So this could be partial quotations from mediators or participants. It could be leaks about upcoming talks. The picture I have here is a leak of a meeting that was held between the Cameroonian government and a senior member of the separatist opposition movement. And when that information was leaked on social media, it was kind of really contributed to a further undermining of trust in the peace process, and many people think contributed to a further stalling of peace talks. This is, to me, the hardest thing to deal with, because malinformation doesn't go against community standards in the same way that harassment or disinformation does. And it's something that's been happening forever, right? The partial quotation or the manipulation of particular facts. But I nonetheless think it's really important that we address it, even if it's much more tricky than some of the others. Third harm that we look at is disinformation to undermine a peace process. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is again from Libya. You'll notice I talk about Libya a lot. It's because it's the place where we have done probably the most extensive research on the link between social media and peace processes. But this was a fake agreement that was circulated during the Libya Political Dialogue Forum that went pretty viral on Facebook, purporting to be what the parties had agreed on. They hadn't actually agreed on this at all. Completely fabricated document, was later debunked by the UN mission, but it nonetheless had quite a significant impact on undermining the negotiations and outcome of those negotiations in the eyes of the public. We've seen this kind of disinformation be used in other places too, but I'm kind of trying to go quickly because we started a little bit late, so we can go into more details in the questions. So the fourth harm that we're looking at is coordinated inauthentic behavior to disrupt or interfere with the peace process. This is, the other three have really focused on content, so what it is that's posted on social media, and this one is focusing much more on behavior, so the way that social media can be used or abused. Again, to go back to the Libya example that I talked about at the beginning, we saw this network of inauthentic accounts being used, really spreading narratives that were directly linked to the UN-led process, that were posting messaging designed to disrupt that process, or at least to undermine trust in it. So these are the kinds of, this is the kind of social media discourse that we are concerned about as mediators working on peace processes. The challenge, though, is, well, okay, we understand that those kinds of things are happening, but how do we know what the result of those things are? And I would say this is still an open question. And again, I really want to emphasize that this chapter is designed to kind of put forward an initial thinking on this topic. So what we are starting to see is that some of this behavior on social media is having an impact, and is at least correlating with increasing challenges when it comes to peace negotiations and peace talks. So, for example, we think that this kind of online behavior has intimidated participants in peace talks, in some cases can influence their positions away from outcomes that are conducive to peace or to an agreement. We also think that a big factor here is public trust and legitimacy, public support for peace processes. And I think a lot of this online behavior can disrupt or erode public support and any resulting agreement. We saw in Colombia the erosion of public support for the FARC, for the agreement with the FARC. I'm not suggesting that social media was solely responsible for that, but we think it definitely played a role. And another important impact, I think, is just the delay and the distraction that this kind of social media noise, when it's powerful, can create. So we saw a lot of time being spent in peace processes in order to counter, for example, that fake agreement that I talked about, and respond to social media content, which limits mediators' ability to actually move forward with a peace process. Again, Libya, the first round of talks that I mentioned at the beginning, November 2020, we saw quite a high level of interference in the online space around those negotiations, particularly coming from this big network that was later taken down. The second round of negotiations that took place the beginning of the following year was more successful. The participants were able to come to an agreement. There was much less social media activity relating to negotiations around that time. So again, this is not necessarily a causation, but it's definitely an interesting correlation. So that's kind of what I would say the key findings are. Of course, much more detail in the chapter, which you can all read soon. But let me move a little bit to talk about recommendations. And my recommendations are structured in 3 parts, because I think that we need to do 3 things, and many different actors are involved in what is needed actually as a response. So first, we need to better understand this issue. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is an underexplored issue in the research. 2, we need to react to whatever is already happening. We need, I think, better responses, particularly from social media platforms, to the kind of challenges that I've just laid out. And third, I think we need to start thinking about prevention. So we don't just want to be stopping this kind of behavior and activity when it's out there, but we want to actually be preventing it. And that's the area I'm particularly interested in, and I think go into the most detail in the chapter. But to go quickly through the first 2, so as I said, there needs to be, I think, more research that looks into this particular issue. There's been so much research now on elections and social media, which is fantastic. There's been increasing amounts of research on hate speech, incitement to violence, but not very much on this, interplay between social media activity and efforts to actually end conflict. So we don't, the fact that research doesn't exist is kind of something that I think about academically, but it's also something we should be deeply concerned about, because the stakes are pretty high, right? You think about Ukraine right now, if social media is in any way disrupting the possibility of negotiations, then we would want to know about it, and we'd want to do something about it too. So that research is really important, even if it ends up proving that actually the impact is more limited than we think. It's really important that we analyze this in more detail. Second recommendation is around reacting. So together with my colleagues, we've been calling on social media platforms to actually take this topic and this issue more seriously. So at the moment, social media platforms are not really paying any major attention to peace talks when they are underway, unless they are also linked with other events that they consider to be high priority, namely elections and various other events. So we're calling for social media platforms to start looking at when major rounds of peace talks are happening, for them to pay particular attention to that place and to the particular issues involved in that peace process. There's a huge precedent now for elections that we think could have some application for peace processes. So things like Facebook Protect that platforms run for candidates in elections, we think could be applied to participants in peace negotiations, for example. So there's a whole set of recommendations around what platforms can do. And then there's this set of recommendations around how do we prevent these issues. So we're not just understanding the way that social media is impacting peace processes, we're not just reacting to it when it does disrupt them, but we're actually trying to be on the front foot and be more proactive. Now, for me, we in the mediation field have a tendency to highlight the issue and then outsource it, in this case, to social media platforms. But I think that's not really good enough. If we are observing that social media is an increasingly important factor in peace negotiations, in the work of conflict mediators, then we should also be integrating social media into our mediation practices, right? And if what we're trying to do is prevent the exacerbation of conflict through dialogue and through agreements, then we should be also preventing the online exacerbation of conflict through agreements. I think this approach could be really useful for the broader issues of hate speech that are brought up and looked into in the rest of this book. It's a way of addressing the problem kind of downstream. So instead of just moderating content or informing and educating people about content, we're actually looking at kind of trying to intervene and stop the problem at source. If we could do this, which you might think is a little bit mad, then I think there would be a really interesting precedent for addressing kind of online harms directly with the people that are spreading those harms. So although this may seem a little bit of a leap from the beginning of the chapter, it's actually not that much of a leap because it's already being done to some extent. Over the last year, we've been experimenting and looking at the ways in which mediators could play a role in mitigating social media risk. We facilitated an agreement in Nigeria, bringing together different communities to come together and sign a social media peace agreement. This kind of social media, this topic has been also included in other peace processes. We saw a local agreement in Syria, even as far back as 2016, that actually included a reference to a cease of provocations on social media, such as Twitter and other similar platforms. So this is already something that mediators have been thinking a bit about, but it hasn't been very developed. Most of what's out there has been relatively limited in terms of scope and impact. And so I think what this chapter is kind of calling for is that we up our efforts across all these levels. So we try to better understand this issue, we try to react more quickly to it, and we really up our efforts to prevent social media discourse from undermining peace processes. I lay out a little bit what these kinds of agreements would look like. So it's not just about preventing particular types of content, hate speech, etc. It's also about preventing certain types of behavior, inauthentic accounts, narrative influence networks, etc. And it's also about ensuring that there's a process so that such agreements can be implemented. So things like monitoring bodies, etc. So go into a little bit more detail on that. This is just an example of the agreement I mentioned in Nigeria, which goes into much more detail than some of the previous kind of clauses that address social media in other agreements. And then the final sort of section in the chapter talks about key challenges to this particular preventive approach, because a lot of the time when I talk about this, people are very quick to dismiss the possibility of preventing social media discourse that harms peace processes. And they dismiss it along three key lines. So the first is incentives. They say, what would incentivize any of these parties that you're talking about to give up their social media capabilities? It's a cheap and deniable weapon, and why wouldn't they just continue to use it? My view is that the same goes for traditional types of mediation. There are, of course, many, many moments when the incentives simply don't exist to come to the table, or once at the table to agree on anything meaningful. But there are times when those incentives do exist, what they call a kind of hurting stalemate. And I believe that the same could apply in the digital space, that there could be moments where there is a value in kind of putting down those digital weapons, as they say. The second line of objection that I have become quite used to is attribution. So people say that it's really difficult to know who does what in the online space. So it would be very difficult to meaningfully prevent or ensure that agreements are upheld. I would say to that yes, there's a lot we don't know about what happens in the online space, but there's also, it's wrong to say that there is no attribution possible in the online space, right? The methods are improving. If you look at the likes of Stanford, Graphica, DFR Lab, they are increasingly attributing, as are the platforms, attributing specific networks, specific types of behavior to specific organizations or individuals or even states. So it's true that not everything is knowable, but there is a level of attribution that I think makes this at least worth exploring further. And then the final challenge that I look into is around monitoring. So people say that it's more difficult to kind of monitor what people are doing in the online space, also linked to this idea of attribution. But again, I think there are many ways around that, including making sure that agreements are very specific and implementable in terms of, not just outlining really large commitments like prevent all hate speech, but going into detail on what exactly is prohibited and encouraged. And we have already in some of the work we've been doing developed monitoring mechanisms that support specifically these kinds of agreements. So that was kind of as quick as I could do it, run through. Essentially what I'm saying in the chapter, maybe just in my own words to try to conclude, is social media, we know, is playing a role in conflict. We believe is playing also a role in efforts to prevent conflict or to resolve conflict in a number of ways that I lay out. And because we have some initial evidence that this is happening, we really need now to not leave this too late, not just let it be an issue that is underexplored until we have our Myanmar moment and suddenly people pay attention, but that actually we all, conflict mediators, research platforms, need to start thinking seriously about the role of social media discourse at these particular moments when the stakes are incredibly high. So I think I'll stop there and I look forward to all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maude. This was fascinating. I have an initial question that I know you go into in a bit more detail in the chapter, but I'm wondering if you could say more about the circumstances that brought the parties to agree to the social media peace agreement in Nigeria, and then the impact that you've seen it have thus far.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the Nigeria example was definitely a pilot, which we went into really as a way to see whether or not this would be possible. So we started it as a dialogue process between 3 different ethnic groups in one area of central Nigeria. We started with a dialogue that went over 3 months, bringing together young people that were kind of micro-influencers in their community. So people that were very active on social media. And the dialogue process asked them, how do they see social media affecting their own communities' interaction and conflict and tensions between the communities. So we started out by getting a set of issues that all these communities felt that these things about the way that their peers were using social media were making things better or worse. And then we built on that, and as they built trust and as they kind of started talking more and more about these issues, they started developing their own actual agreement that they signed up to. And what's been quite interesting is initially that was just signed between the youth that were part of that dialogue process. So they're 30. And since then, they've actually taken it to their communities. And now we've had their community leaders sign on, and even some other ethnic groups in the areas that have decided that they want to also build their kind of capacity and understanding of how social media can affect conflict. So I think, it worked in that particular case because we had invested in a dialogue process that was specifically focused on the social media issue. And the issues that they were dealing with were quite stark and quite clear. Like, for example, one of the things that they were really concerned about is the sharing of pictures of dead bodies or graphic images after attacks. It's a little bit different to actually the kind of social media things that I was talking about around peace processes. So it kind of lent itself more to that approach. And we have seen an impact. I mean, we have seen, and they have said that they have a kind of increased awareness of this issue, and also that at times of high tension, of which there have been many since the agreement was signed, there is a less quick spread of those kinds of images, for example, in the aftermath of attacks. So, you know, it's an interesting example that I think we now want to build on and expand.
Thank you. I see Babak has a question as well.
Thank you very much for your talk. How do you react as social media peace mediators when the political dynamics change very rapidly? For example, you know, with an invasion suddenly that you didn't anticipate, what do you do as the third party monitoring and mediating an activity on social media then when the political dynamics rapidly change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the same thing that you would do as a mediator not focused on social media, right, is you're constantly trying to assess where the parties are, what the positions are. And for me, like, our work is really to complement the work of our teams. So if we have teams working on the ground and the political dynamics shift as dramatically as they just have in that part of the world, then one of the things we can do and are doing is also look at the shifting social media dynamics. So how are things shifting online, and how can that feed into their assessment of changing political dynamics? So that's about utilizing social media to inform yourself of the political dynamics, and using the kind of monitoring analysis mechanisms that are already in place to keep the finger on the pulse. But I don't think it's particularly different to kind of offline mediation, and it's just a complement to what is already being done, actually.
Thank you very much.
We have some questions from the chat. Thank you for a great presentation. What are your thoughts on how bans of social media, for instance, Russian government banning Meta and announcing them as an extremist organization, have on the advancement of this cause, as well as on their continued role in information operations?
Yeah, I mean, internet shutdowns in general are a big challenge, and what is happening in Russia right now is particularly challenging because if we go back to this idea of social media agreements, right, in order to actually develop any kind of consensus on what should and shouldn't be possible on social media, you kind of need to have a common interpretation of what that social media is. And right now we're going to see less and less places where people from either side are actually interacting on the same platform. So it's going to make this A, the job of monitoring what is happening online, and B, the job of actually finding kind of common uses, or developing common standards for social media uses is just going to be really, really difficult. And then I'm not naive to think that a social media peace agreement that prevents information operations from Russia is going to be on the table right now. I think that, you know, this is not an easy, as I said, these kind of weapons are cheap, deniable, really powerful, and in some cases very effective. So they're not going to be the first things that people give up. But I don't think that means that we should ignore this issue and just accept that it's going to happen and that it'll be continuously used and there's nothing we can do about it.
There's another question about how you see Israel-Palestine as fitting into this larger framework of social media peace agreements. I don't know if there's more context to that question, or.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what exactly is meant there, because I think it's quite a big question.
Okay, so there is context. I maintain a widely viewed online forum that has attempted to basically unilaterally put in the equivalent of one of these social media peace agreements.
Mhm.
But getting wider buy-in from people on the platform as a whole would be a very nice pilot case study.
Mhm.
That would be one of the ways. Have guidelines for this forum, and those are an attempt at a unilateral tamping down of the extremism.
Mhm.
I was very interested in what you said about Nigeria, and I'm wondering if what was done in Nigeria, for example, could be a model for what could be done on what could be done about Israel-Palestine, at least at the platform level.
Yeah, I mean,
helps.
yeah, I defer to you in terms of how that would actually work, because you're obviously much more involved than I am, but I'd be happy to share more information about what we did in Nigeria and what we've done in other places. We haven't worked in that area specifically on this topic, so I would be happy to chat more. But I definitely think it sounds like an interesting avenue. And I actually think the point you raise about, you're already trying to do this in one of your online forums, it's actually happening a lot, right? A lot of different forums, different places are starting to realize that we actually have to develop our own norms and guidelines for how we use social media, because the existing rules that are out there don't work for a lot of things, including the kinds of things I laid out here. And so there's a lot of this kind of like organically developing our own standards and norms. But the question is, like, how do we build more of that and build it up, and also get buy-in from those that are most in violation of those norms? So maybe you can send me an email and we can chat further, Rebecca, if it's helpful.
Thank you. That would be amazing. That would be amazing. Yeah. I'd love to chat with you, and I'd love to learn more about your own case studies and how we can apply this to our case study.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat about broadening the implementation of social media peace agreements. So you mentioned that this is in a pilot phase, and I'm wondering if you can speak to your or other efforts to broaden its implementation, and specifically whether you have any thoughts or advice on larger, specifically multilateral organizations getting involved in this approach.
Mm-hmm. So where we are now is we've been running pilots, social media agreement pilots I think we've done 3 or 4, including around several elections. So we did one in Kosovo last year. We did one around the Indonesia local elections. In Nigeria specifically, we're expanding now to another area, and also thinking ahead to the elections next year, which will be quite important. So there's this link, as you see, between kind of the peace processes as we see them, and also often leading in or bleeding into elections. So yeah, we, I guess, are actively doing this in several places. Also where there are existing negotiations, we're really working with our colleagues to think through how can social media be embedded within existing peace negotiations, so as a topic for dialogue, or as a clause in existing agreements. So we're quite actively, I'd say, like, this is the bulk of our social media and conflict work at HD, is focusing on this. And then the role of large organizations, I mean, I think, I don't know, there's a lot I could say on this, but one really challenging thing has been actually getting the platforms to engage in this topic and to cooperate. And I think we need them at multiple levels, because we need them also in the research phase. I talked a little bit about this, but we need collaboration in terms of data access from platforms. We also could really use their support in terms of the reaction phase, so in terms of actually adapting their policies. and in the monitoring and implementation of agreements phase. So there's a lot we could do with their cooperation, but we are limited in our power to persuade. So I think that's one area where additional support from those that have more weight would be helpful and welcome.
I have another question that touches on your answer to Rebecca's question earlier. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the process of developing these agreements. To be effective, you mentioned that they need to be responsive to the local norms and like the particular variety of harmful content that is relevant to the conflict that they are attempting to resolve. And so if you could speak more about how that ends up serving as inputs into the agreement and how it shapes the content of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say like you do X, Y, Z steps and then you achieve the outcome, right? Because every mediation process is so different and non-linear and goes in multiple steps. But to really simplify, I think the way that we have started to approach this is start by identifying what is it about the social media space that is damaging each party. So what are some of the things that are hurting you in the online space? Getting already those lists is something that often mediators just haven't been doing. You know, they are constantly trying to understand parties' positions and interests in other realms, but so it's about translating that into the social media space too. So that's one thing, and then starting from that to look at, well, where are the overlaps? What are some of the areas where there might be room for consensus on developing sort of guidelines or norms or agreements on particular behaviors? And then I think I would say one thing that really is important is making these quite specific. So not just saying, oh yeah, we agree not to use inflammatory language on social media, because that will be impossible to define and implement. So once you have those kind of common understanding of what the issues are, then drilling down to make them more specific. And then of course, having already in place a kind of monitoring body that understands the social media environment and can help monitor the implementation of those agreements. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, Nora.
It does, thank you. And in setting up that monitoring body, is that something that's difficult for parties to agree to, or?
Again, I would say like this isn't madly different from other types of monitoring bodies, right? It's in an ideal situation would be an existing monitoring body that has additional social media capabilities, so that can also monitor the online space. So yeah, I think it has to be a body that has the trust of the parties, whether it's them themselves working together or whether it's a third party body. And then it has to have the capacity to monitor social media space, which yeah. So in various different pilots that we've run, we've set up different types of monitoring bodies, all of them kind of third party monitoring, working with actors that had or were supported to gain the skills in social media monitoring. But they were also part of the communities of the signatories so that they were trusted by them. So yeah. It depends very much on the context and also the level of agreement. Like if you're talking local level agreement, you're of course going to be talking different level of monitoring body than you would if you were talking a large kind of regional agreement or interstate agreement.
Okay. Thank you. So we are about at time now. So I wanted to thank you again for your research on this, for this presentation, for the forthcoming chapter on it as well. And then a quick plug that this is part of a larger series of seminars that are up on the School for Media and Peacebuilding Affairs website and on the Eventbrite as well. So please look out for additional events. And thank you all for attending, and thank you, Maude, for all your work, for your presentation. And we look forward to seeing all of you at the future events.
Thank you.